So today we are going to take a look at How to Spend $75 billion to Make the World a Better Place by Bjorn Lomborg. Um, this book I really enjoyed. It's not like a lot of other books I've read. Uh, it's fairly short and pamphlet like. It does it explores a research done by the Copenhagen. It's not collective. What is it called? Copenhagen something consensus, which gathers to do cost benefit analysis of philanthropic efforts. And one of the things that I think is problematic about philanthropy in general is people find a cause and they read about it and they decide they think it's important and they donate money to it, and then it turns out that their money just doesn't do a lot in terms of producing good outcomes. And I think a lot of people, you know, when their philanthropic efforts are made with their gut and not informed by particularly good information, instead appeals to their emotions. And so, if you really want to be an effective giver, you ought to know how effective your money is being. And so, doing a cost benefit analysis might be a really good way of making sure your money goes a long way. And so, the directive of the consensus is if you have $75 billion, how do you spend it in order to make the world a better place over the course of 4 years? So, specifically, short term stuff is higher valued. Um, a lot of the stuff in there is fairly interesting. Uh, the general theme of types of things that are ranked higher in general that you might not expect are stuff like if you uh, help with nutrition or nutrients with children who are young, you produce much better outcomes over the course of their lifetime. And so, also, if you increase education levels, you achieve good outcomes. And so, a lot of the prescriptions are like bundled packages where you are um, engaging in deworming, and inoculating children and giving them nutrients, because during the critical period when they're growing up, making sure that they have a lot of nutrients uh, means that, or it will ensure that they have good outcomes over the course of their lifetime, increases lifetime earnings, that sort of thing. And it's relatively inexpensive to distribute multivitamins and that sort of thing relative to more intensive efforts to like distribute food. So it's a more targeted effort. There are also things like early warning systems for uh, natural disasters are pretty good. And what they do is they look at a whole bunch of proposals and they do a cost benefit. So, like, I think that the childhood nutrition interventions were like 30 to 1. So for every dollar you spend, you get like $30 return. And then a lot of things are perhaps less effective, like noticeably low on the lists were stuff to do with global warming, mainly because it's just hard to see how effective it is, which doesn't necessarily mean it's not important, but you have these economists who are trying to look at things. One of the interesting things relative to global warming is this doesn't deal with CO2, so it's not a comprehensive solution. But there's apparently an avenue of research towards releasing a type of gas into the atmosphere that is more reflective, which would lower the temperature of the Earth. Now, again, this doesn't decrease CO2, so it's not a complete solution, but research for taking a look at that has potentially really high returns, and they talked about it, and I'm shocked that I've never heard about it outside of this book. Um, in topics of global warming, um, it's just it's incredible that it's I've never heard it mentioned. This book The Copenhagen Consensus took place in 2012, so it's not new information. Uh, anyways, um, what this book seems to suggest to me is that if you wanted to make the world a better place with your donations, doing stuff like making sure that children are inoculated and get proper nutrition, specifically nutrient supplements, is a pretty good way to go about it. Um, there are other interventions that are not particularly effective. I wasn't as focused on the ones that weren't effective. I just thought it was interesting that, like another one that's particularly effective is paying kids to go to school in low income areas. Just because they really go to school when you give them just a little bit of money. Or their parents really make sure they go to school, which it seems like an interesting or a strange intervention, but like in terms of conceiving of it. But then, like, if you sit back and you think about it for a second, it makes a lot of sense. So for utility, I give it a 6. It's a pretty short read. Um, I think that if it informs your philanthropic efforts for the rest of your life in a substantive way, that's pretty high utility, even though you're not getting the utility. It's kind of strange to rate for utility because the utility doesn't affect you. I think in theory you probably feel just about as good giving money if your money's not effective as if when it is. But the utility, it does confer utility onto the people you're giving to. So perhaps the utility on this is way higher depending on how important the efficacy of your philanthropy is. It's strange to rate because I don't think it improves the quality of one's own life, probably at all. But if you're engaged in philanthropy and you're like missing the mark, that's probably not ideal. For entertainment, I gave it 2.5. It's really dry. It's not. I mean, some things about it were pretty interesting, but it's like, oh, the cost benefit of this is this amount. This is problem is because blank blank. It's good because of blank blank. Like it's not entertaining. Interesting. I give it a 6.5. It's interesting to see how some interventions are more effective than others, and that promoting ecological diversity, I think scored incredibly low, and that like if you wanted to stop deforestation, one of the more cost-efficient ways of doing it is improving farming techniques, because if the farming gets more effective, there's less need to deforest or to try and get new farmland. And so I just thought that that was like interesting. So like instead of saving a tree, you should try and increase farming output. Was like one of the implications, or you do both. For novelty, I gave it a 9. I think that not thinking of how effective your charitable dollars are being and engaging in charity is probably a bad look, and just looking at just a little bit of information on that topic is probably goes a long way to making your charitable contributions more effective. For style, I gave it a 6.5. It is really boring, but it's also very clear. So I think that's kind of the way that this type of book should be written. It's very straightforward and to the point. It's very short. So yeah, for readability, I gave it a 6. Uh, it's fairly well organized, but it's not. I don't know if I would say that it is translated from economic to layperson. Uh, I think it's translated fairly well, but like it could be more accessible to the layperson, so you don't score higher on readability. For difficulty, I give it a 4.5. Slightly difficult. If you don't have a handle on some understanding of economics, specifically like the idea of opportunity to cost, the book might seem a little obtuse. The book isn't arguing that any of these charities are bad, just some are more efficient than others. And if you have a limited amount of money, say $75 billion, that means you invest in some things and you don't invest in others. It doesn't mean that the things you don't invest in are bad. It just means they're not as effective, right? It's a reality that there's a limited amount of money to put towards making the world a better place. And okay, it got an overall rating of a 5.86. I think that this book, as far as recommendations go, I would recommend it to anyone who's making sizable philanthropic contributions, and that is, I think, just about the only group I would recommend to. Perhaps people who are involved in like political decisions, who, that involve somehow where the money's going, that sort of thing. Um, it's interesting for conversation a little bit, but for the most part, just making your charitable contributions more effective is, I think, where this would go. And if you like this, feel free to give it a like or subscribe. As far as discussion goes, what philanthropic efforts do you think are particularly effective, or should be paid more attention to? I know before reading this, I thought like, oh, mosquito nets are great. Uh, or a while before it, I was like, oh, mosquito nets are great. They're cheap. They're easy to distribute. They combat malaria. And then a little bit later, I read that like, oh, the mosquito nets are not the best because like they don't even have beds and like they can't even use the mosquito nets. They repurpose them for other things. It's like, oh, maybe they're not so effective. And then one of my thoughts was like, oh, distribution of feminine hygiene products and birth control is particularly important because I'd seen some correlative data on when you when you have that in a society, the society tends to get a lot more egalitarian. And then looking through this data, the cost efficacy of that is seems relatively middling and is perhaps longer term, and it scored fairly high, but not as high as say just giving multivitamins to kids and deworming. Um, so, what efforts do you think are particularly effective and why? Might be interesting for a discussion. Anyways, have a good one.